I think the other piece of this discussion is the fact that renewables typically are intermittent, and that intermittency creates issues on the grid. The ability of that grid to respond to the intermittency, I think, is going to be directly related to the ability of the natural gas industry to respond when wind farms, when the wind's not blowing, when the sun's not shining. And so this issue of, in so many instances, I've spoken on several panels, and wind developers will describe that, they're competing with natural gas on the margin. And I would argue with them to say, no, you're really not. The reality is that we are codependent, that really if there is wind on the grid, you need to think about how you're going to respond to that intermittency and what technologies you will bring to bear. And it may be more advantageous for us to more closely couple these technologies, these natural gas technologies, to renewables. And I think as our policymakers get to understand that more, I think it's going to be critically important. There was a recent article in the Wall Street Journal that described having wind generation resources on a grid that was primarily, from a base load standpoint, coal. And the fact that the intermittency was creating even more carbon emissions, or based on the study. And so these issues, again, I think it's been said very well, and that is, we tend to think of these technologies in various silos. We tend to think of them as separate industries, but when we really need to think about them in more holistic and integrated ways.
Well, it would seem that
Frank, just a sort of a rhetorical question to throw out at the end. I mean, isn't the cleanest resource the resource you don't have to use? And so if you are actually able to generate 3 times the energy, or about 3 times the available energy in the form of electricity or thermal energy, by you consuming the same amount of fuel, isn't that the cleanest resource in the end? I mean, you don't have to go down that path of sort of defining what's clean or renewable. I mean, if I don't have to use it, it's going to be there for a longer period of time.
Well, that goes to the point of the more efficient you are, the more sustainable you really are. Because if we're talking about natural gas while it's abundant, and I want to get on the question of fuel supply, the longer that we can prolong that U.S. fuel resource by having best and highest efficiency technologies generating power and converting that fuel, the longer those supplies will last. But on that question of fuel supply, we've got a significant, in the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a significant growth in the supply of natural gas, predominantly up here in the Northeast, Pennsylvania, New York, the upper Appalachian area, from the Marcellus shale discoveries. It's been represented there'll be long-term supplies, and these supplies are really within 300 miles of most of our northeastern U.S., which is rare because we don't find ourselves in the Northeast as having much of any kind of supply resources. This appears as if it's a great opportunity to couple clean fuel with clean fuel conversion technologies such as fuel cells. What's required at the federal and state level and by industry to foster the development of those gas resources and fuel cells?
I think one of the first things you need to have recognized is the need to have a full fuel cycle philosophy going forward. When I say that is that you need to take into account where that energy is needed, when it's needed, and how you're going to provide that energy the most economical and affordable as possible and efficient. And when you get into that full fuel cycle energy analysis, you begin to realize that the best way to use that energy is to use something like a natural gas delivery system and deliver that gas to the point of use, where you now can optimize that in its most efficient form.
Jim, it would appear that our energy standards, building codes today do not take into account that full cycle. That what we look at is from the point the energy is used in the building or in the complex, and that we don't look all the way back to the full cycle. Is that fair?
It's fair, and it's becoming more and more of a push that there's a need for that, a recognition for that the building codes and the appliance standards begin to adopt that philosophy as they move forward, because that particular step among those things that are necessary to become, having natural gas become more of the standard bearer, if you will, and the direct use and ultimately the use of fuel cells and other types of distributed generation would be, they would be optimized by that availability.
It would also appear that the failure of those standards to take into account the efficiency of power generation coming to the building means that fuel cells get sort of naturally discriminated against in that equation, because the efficiency gains of the fuel cells don't get really seen in the building. They get seen external to the building.
Frank, if I could expand on your thought there, can I ask how many people in the audience are aware of the fact that the U.S. Department of Energy has a notice of inquiry out right now where they're asking about, and they're asking for comments on full fuel cycle analysis? Not too many. Do you work for DOE, sir? Oh, okay. Well, I mean, it's one of the things that as part of our Smart Energy Future project, I hope that our group musters itself, because we just found out about this within the last couple of weeks, and files comments on that exact same point. If you don't look at the full fuel cycle, really with anything you're comparing apples to oranges. You know, you're just not getting a fair comparison, and educating Congress and the people that are making our laws, and DOE is one of the people that, you know, creates regulations and they advise the Congress on programs. You know, that's a key important aspect of, you know, for your industry, for the natural gas industry. Natural gas is 92% efficient getting to the end user, and electricity is what, somewhere between 25 and 35% efficient getting to the end user. So it's a great big difference when you take the full analysis into effect.
Interesting.
I think it's so, I'm sorry, I think it's so critical that this is done. I hear so often that electric vehicles are zero generation vehicles, and the fact of the matter is, just because they don't have a tailpipe on the vehicle, well, their tailpipe is at the end of that, at that power generation plant. You know, it could be some 100 miles away. And so the fact of the matter is, you have to take these things into consideration in order to be able to compare apples and apples.
Dave, you had a point?
Just, you asked the question, what do governments or policymakers need to do? I think if you look at, there's been a very narrow focus on maybe renewable standards, but we've heard low carbon, maybe you call it low impact, clean energy. The reality is we should be looking at how we incent the result rather than maybe specific technologies. And unfortunately, fuel cells do find themselves kind of offside sometimes. I mean, if you take renewable fuels as an example, it's perfectly acceptable in many of the areas we're trying to do business to burn whatever that renewable feedstock is in 30-year-old combustion technologies. Whereas you would get more output, useful energy, both heat and electricity, if you were to use something like a fuel cell on many of these feedstocks, and you eliminate the pollutants and all these things, and yet there's no mandate to use the cleanest and the most efficient technology on what really is a very finite renewable feedstock today. And then when you look at natural gas and its prevalence, if you could start to pull these more efficient technologies in to the marketplace so that maybe you're not paying the premium on the renewable fuel and some other new technology, you can start to attract capital investment to fuel cells on the most efficient, cleanest use of fossil as well. And so it doesn't have to be one or the other. I guess the only other point, intermittency was talked about. We never talk about the carbon footprint associated with that intermittency. And so when you start to look at renewable standards, it's always assumed solar PV, no carbon footprint. Well, we're not here to badmouth solar. Enbridge has the largest solar PV array at 80 megawatts in North America. We're a substantial investor in wind, but we still see fuel cells for their predictable, low emission, efficient capacity as something that just isn't being looked at on the policy side.
Yeah, I want to chase the capacity piece just a little bit further, because many people talk about the energy availability from wind or from solar, whatever. What they don't recognize, and it just continued to beat that drum about the intermittency, but it's very important to recognize that one of the enabling technologies, one of the most important enabling pieces of that is that natural gas complement that could be added to that, that essentially takes that wind generation or that renewable source of energy to its true capacity capability if you were to integrate it with natural gas. It's an important factor that I think it's assumed that natural gas will be there when it's needed, but there needs to be a more obvious recognition of that true capability and value to have that linkage between those two, that interdependency.
I want to shift a little bit before we open up for questions back toward technology. And you talked about Jim, you just mentioned the complement of natural gas systems to the smart grid and to intelligent grid. But natural gas, I want to talk about storage for a moment. The natural gas industry has been at the leading edge of storing gas in bulk in large underground fields and for peak use on distribution systems in the form of LNG and propane storage. Fuel cells have the capability of generating hydrogen either through reforming or through some electrochemical separation, and therefore you can store that hydrogen as if you have a battery. There's a lot of talk on the electric grid about batteries. But given the experience in storage that the gas industry has, do you see an interest in fuel cell systems which can both consume gas as well as provide local hydrogen storage?
Well, I certainly do. At AGR Resources, we own two storage facilities, one in Louisiana just off the Henry Hub. The Henry Hub is the typical trading point for natural gas that's sold here in the United States. And so we're very familiar with operating storage. We're very familiar with developing storage. Primarily, we develop salt dome storage. Salt dome storage would likely be the type of storage that would be used for hydrogen. There are many technical barriers, but the fact of the matter is there's a tremendous amount of capacity, there's a tremendous amount of competency, strategic competency within the natural gas industry associated with storage and how that competency might be brought to bear on this particular problem. Let's think about this just in terms of the broader industry. Natural gas is about a 21, 22 trillion cubic feet a year of natural gas is sold. We have storage that approaches anywhere from 3.8 to 4 trillion cubic feet. And so on any given time, we could store 20% of the total fuel that's used here in the United States. That's a tremendous amount of storage on our system. And as you described as well, some of the other storage could be on-system peaking. We also operate LNG, what we call LNG peakers, where we will liquefy natural gas, store it in large tanks. We have about 7 BCF of storage on our system that's used and deployed when we need it on the coldest days of the year. So all of these are assets that reside within, already on the natural gas energy system. But not only are we talking about an entire set of assets that could be put to use to solve these problems, we're also talking about a competency that can be brought to bear to solve some of these problems. And as you mentioned, the potential use of reformed natural gas to generate hydrogen. We could even envision, if you will, a refueling station that would have liquefied natural gas, compressed natural gas, and hydrogen available at one particular refueling station. And so as we think about all of these things and how this might play out in the industry, I think, again, it's so critically important that we are thinking about them in more holistic ways. And what are the competencies that we already have that, you know what, there's not a lot of research and development that needs to be done in order for us to solve a lot of the storage issues that might exist.
Anyone else on that subject, or?